Hello and welcome to this episode of NRI Affairs, Pause with Nandini. Today's a bit unusual. I normally have one guest, but today I've got four exceptional women here with me, and we're all here to talk about this beauty right here, growing up Indian in Australia. It's edited by Aarti Betigeri, and I have three of the lovely contributors here with us today. I have Preeti Maharaj, who's written Tangle of Tenses, Swagata Bapat, who's written The Dance Performance, and Rakhee Gelani, who's written a piece called Navratri. Very different pieces, lots of really interesting things that come up. I just wanted to read a little bit about each of them. So then you'll get to know them a little bit better. But of course, we're going to ask a lot of questions and get a lot of interesting answers from our panelists. So Aarti is a journalist, a writer, broadcaster, and former foreign correspondent, born in Melbourne to parents from Maharashtra and Karnataka. After an early career as a radio and television news presenter and producer with SBS and the ABC, she moved to India to fulfill a long-held dream to report on South Asia and lived in New Delhi for almost a decade. Sounds like a dream. But currently she works as a journalist and advisor focusing on international relations. Her name is surprisingly easy to pronounce, as this book tells us. Swagata Bapat is a second-generation Indian Australian who was raised and lives in Melbourne. She works in her business, Swagata Bapat Consulting, as an executive coach, facilitator, and consultant with a vision of promoting mental health and well-being in individuals, workplaces, and communities. Can't have enough of that. I also have Rakhee Gelani, who's born in country Victoria, shaped by her parents' stories of East Africa, delectable Gujarati delicacies, and adventures to far-off countries that began before she could even walk. She now lives and works in Melbourne and shares her love of travel, great food, and cats with her cheeky young daughter. What lovely little intros. Preeti Maharaj was born in Fiji. She's the descendant of Girmityas. Did I say that right? Girmityas? All right. Who were indentured laborers taken from India to work in the sugarcane fields of Fiji by the British. She immigrated to Australia with her family when she was 12 after two military coups. She remains eternally grateful to her ancestors for their tenacity and fortitude. She lives, works, and writes with gratitude on the lines of the Kulin Nation in now Melbourne. So those are our lovely introductions. Now, this anthology obviously has many more contributors, and perhaps as we go along, I'll mention a few of the more interesting names that I came across. But evidently, the stories are very diverse and intimate portrayals of growing up Indian in Australia. Aarti, I'll begin with you. You say this is the story of migrant experiences. As diverse as they are, what were some of your discoveries as you worked on this book and received so many submissions from all over?
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Nandini. I'm really thankful that NRI Affairs has decided to do this in this format and include all these fantastic voices. When I was approached to do this, it was about 1.5 years ago now, I had a long think about my experiences. I thought about the format of the book and who the intended audience would be. And I came to the conclusion that there are multiple different experiences and multiple different trajectories of the Indian or South Asian migrant experience. But in that, they mirror some of the other migrant experiences that many others who've come to Australia have had. And I came to that with the benefit of my own experience. I worked at SBS for a number of years, reporting quite intimately on migrant and ethnic communities, mostly in Melbourne at the time. And I became really accustomed to them and their stories and became quite intimately acquainted with them. And I realised how many similarities there were with my own experiences. And then, as you mentioned, I moved to India as an adult, and my parents are from, South-ish India, but I lived in New Delhi. And it is a whole world apart. It was like another universe. I didn't speak the language. I didn't, eat the food. I didn't know the codes of the city, and I didn't know the codes of the North, which North Indians might know, or they might be able to kind of get by or learn to understand. But it was all so new to me. And a city like New Delhi, it's quite extractive and rapacious. It's not gentle or kind to newcomers, as anyone who's lived there knows. So, just doing the basics, trying to get a gas connection lined up, trying to get an auto rickshaw somewhere, were quite difficult experiences if you don't know how it all operates. If you don't know that you're meant to bribe the guy at the gas office to get a gas connection, which I didn't know. He said, come back, I won't speak in Hindi, but he would say, just come back in 10 days, madam, and give you that look. And I didn't know the look. So I would just go, okay, sure. And I'd go back in 10 days and, still it'd be another 10 days, another 10 days, because I didn't understand that the whole point was to bribe. So when I came back to Australia, I came with a very new perspective. I came with the understanding of what it is to be a migrant in a new, strange, bewildering place. And I wanted the book to really reflect that. I wanted it to reflect as many of the Indian experiences as possible, because of course they're not just about, the language group or the culture or the religion that you come from, but also about socioeconomic status. That has a huge impact on how you experience a new country as a migrant. And I knew that was very, very much the case with the, excuse me, the Indian community. So I knew that the book it couldn't address everything, but it could try. And as much as possible, I wanted migrants from other groups to be able to read it. And, they might not be able to see themselves in certain cultural references, but certainly the experience.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, and I'm sure it will travel in that way because just the experiences themselves, while they are diverse, there are certain unifying things I would imagine with other migrants and other experiences. And sometimes perhaps the connections of, for instance, young people across migrant groups may be more similar than experiences across generations. So there is that as well. The stories themselves that I have read speak of many things, and not all of those things are necessarily pleasant experiences. There are difficult conversations to be had around some of those stories. I do want to talk to Preeti specifically about displacement and dislocation. And I imagine that as these are subjective, they also have some commonalities, speaking to what we were just talking about earlier. And if you wanted to just give us some reflections on that in your experience.
I think for me, the story that I've written about was so deeply traumatic for lots of layers. The incident itself on the train with the racism, but also the issue of, having to leave after 2 military coups, and there were 2 more after that. So the thing that allowed me to get to a point, and this is coming back to that story about commonalities, the reason I was able to come to a point where I could finally talk about it after many years of not talking about it is because I worked in schools as a teacher in communities that had experienced trauma and displacement. And I worked with refugees and asylum seekers and First Nations students, and lots of similar stories, or stories that were far worse. And the commonalities are to do with community and to do with family and to do with food, and food as the great unifier. I don't know if anyone has had the pleasure of watching High on the Hog, that American documentary series, and it's all about food across the history, across cultures, and how how we hold on to food like we do in Fiji from India. Because that's another product of displacement in my history, the displacement of indentureships. And Gurmitia comes from, the 5 to 10 year agreements they had to sign before they were taken to work on the sugarcane fields, except a lot of them couldn't read or write. So they did thumbprints and actually didn't know where they were going. So there's lots of layers of displacement and dispossession in that story. And for me, the healing thing was talking to children who were experiencing it and trying to make sense of that kind of shared heritage, and doing it in our classroom together, that allowed me to make sense of it. So I think absolutely the stories are not just about diaspora Indian experiences or displacement or trauma. They're about a universal connecting experience of how we collectively move through trauma and come out the other side as we try to figure out who we are in a new place. And in terms of diaspora, it's really interesting because Fiji Indians have tried to figure out who they are as they've been displaced into Fiji through trauma. And then once again, whether, huge populations have entered New Zealand or Sydney or Melbourne or Canada or the US, once again, what is that Indian identity? And I think for a lot of us, that displacement after the cruise has actually crystallized our Pacifica identity a lot more as a distinct Indian identity that is an homage and feels connected to India culturally, but also is Pacifica as well. And I think when you are generationally either born here and your parents are trying to hold you back to that place that they were displaced from, and they may have nostalgic ideas or memories of it, but you go back and you don't quite feel that way. So those stories and those connections. So I think, I don't know if that quite answers what you were seeking, but it's about displacement and it's about trauma, but it's also about moving through it in a way that allows you to survive and to celebrate what you have. And I think for me, doing that with children in a classroom who were about the same age as when I experienced it has been what's been healing for me.
What a wonderful response. And so much to think about even just in that. But as something you said right in the beginning of your answer to that was that it took you time. It took you time to get to the point where you could speak. And that led me to thinking that there is this inherent tension, perhaps, between reconciling to the past and also finding our place in the world today. And maybe you need to find your place in the world today before you find it within yourself to go back and revisit things of trauma, things of generational sort of displacement and all of that. And I find I'm in my 40s now, late 40s now, and there's so much that I address within myself now, which I haven't for years and years and years. So I could really relate to what you said. Would love anyone else, if you wanted to talk to this theme of displacement and perhaps some trauma as well that we're dealing with in different ways.
No, I'm just trying to say the floor is yours, Rakhee.
Maybe
I don't have a comment about displacement so much as really connecting with what you're saying, Preeti, about you actually can work through that trauma by offering services or support to other people who are doing it. And I feel like that's a bit of a theme for me as well, that actually working in the kind of multicultural mental health space really helped me by allowing me to do work, but that were things that I really related to on a personal level. So I really liked what you were saying about that.
Yes, I think that was wonderful. I also meant to talk about something which I didn't end up as I was doing my introduction, is the beautiful cover. And there's a story about the cover itself that I read, and I was very pleased to see how beautifully it integrates the Australian and Indian experience and motives. So there is a little story in there about matchbox covers. So I would encourage our viewers and listeners to get the book, to read that story, and then relate the cover to that. But moving on to Rakhee, I have a specific question. I loved your story, by the way, about, and especially the things about mothers and connecting to that. And, it's one of those things I feel the relationship as we've gotten older through our mothers and seeing some of the ways in which we connect to our daughters or our children, and the passing on and the departures from what our mothers were, and finding a lot of our mothers in ourselves. It's again, these are things that I think across cultures women will relate to and understand. So I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the influence of mothers shaping our identities or your identity as a woman of color. What are the points of departure, and how is that relationship informed your relationship with your daughter?
It's interesting. I think as you said, when we're young, we're never going to be like our mother. We're never going to be like her. We're going to be completely different. And I think if you asked my daughter, she'd tell you I am completely different to my mother. But all I see in myself is my mother every day.
Can you hear her in your voice?
I can hear her constantly. And I think particularly for us, it's interesting because tonight I had dinner at my mother's house tonight with my daughter and just the three of us, which is how we spend most of our time now because my father passed away and I'm mum's primary carer. And so I spend a lot of time in that multi-generational world with just three girls, basically. And what I love is watching how my mother is so different as the way she relates to my daughter than she ever did with me. She's not harsh on her about her grades at school. She's not picking on her about anything, her weight, what she's wearing, what she's doing, or anything like that. But it's just pure love. And it's very different to how I felt growing up, where mum was always, picking, I was always having to do and be the right girl, which was, part of what the story was about. I was doing what was expected of me by my mother rather than what I really wanted to do. And I never wanted to put that on my child, but I have. And she seems to be coping with it all right. But I think mothers play a very interesting role in the Indian culture. It's a very maternal culture in many ways, where a lot of what you learn is passed on by them. And whilst my father was a very big figure in my life, I think about all the things I've learned, and the cooking and the home and the way you dress, and the thoughts around my ethics and the way I believe my morals are largely shaped by my mother. And I think that's quite common in a lot of Indian cultures that I've seen, or people I know who've been raised. They look at their mother as that driving force, which is quite interesting when, like Aarti, I went back and lived in India for 6 years, and that's where Aarti and I first crossed paths. But there, it's such a patriarchal society. It's completely the reverse, yet it's the women who really are the force behind everyone and everything in that culture. And for me, I became a mother in India because I adopted my daughter there. And, one of my decisions to return back to Australia was very much because I did not want to raise a daughter in that country. I wanted to raise her here, where I knew she would be safer and I'd be able to protect her more. And so it's an interesting thing in that I want her to know her culture, but I'm going to teach it to her here, because the country of her birth is not the one where I think she can learn it. And I think that's probably partly being someone who was raised here rather than raised in India or raised in East Africa like my parents. I take that and look at the culture differently as a parent, and I'm bringing that Western side as well.
No, I think that response was great. I think one of the things that becomes sort of a fulcrum of identity, I think, is the mother and all of those things that revisit us as we go through life. And sometimes, it's the challenges that were hard to understand when we were younger become perhaps a little bit easier to understand as we get older. And again, what you said about Indian society being quite patriarchal and the role of women, I know that this might be quite triggering for our audiences in India, perhaps to even hear or acknowledge. But I do believe that if we don't talk about these things openly, and if we don't address them as women of this generation, it's going to be very hard to change anything. So, in one way, even in these small interactions that we have as women, we need to talk about these things. We need to talk about the kind of pressure that women and young girls are put through in patriarchal societies, how difficult it is to find your voice. It's almost like you have to fight for your voice, which is perhaps, not that much of a case in societies like in Australia. So I see what you're saying about wanting to raise a daughter here. At the same time, I do believe that in India as well, these kind of conversations have come to the forefront, and there are more women challenging those norms, whether it's in homes or at the workplace. even in smaller towns and cities. And I suppose that's a welcome change.
So can I just say something on that
Yes.
point? I really love that the conversation's gone to this place, because it's something that so far the interviews and the conversations I've had about the book have not gone to this place. And I really wanted to talk about gender, because I feel like it's a gap in the book. And I tried really hard to plug it, but it just didn't happen in the way that I would have liked, because the book was, of course, opt-in. You know, people submitted stories, and they submitted the stories that they wanted to submit, and it was up to me to select them. And I did, in a very limited way, go out and commission stories. But I really wanted to get something that spoke to the gender issues in the Indian culture. And there was one, I don't want to talk about it in too much detail because it's quite traumatic. You know, incredibly generous of the writer to put her experience out there like that, but we couldn't put it in for legal considerations. It was just considered to be too legally risky. And that's probably the piece that I feel really mournful about, because I feel like that's a gap in the book that I really wish I'd been able to plug that and have, you know, use that story as a way to launch, you know, some quite intense conversations around gender in the Indian and South Asian community in Australia, not in India, but what's happening in Australia, because anyone who follows what's going on knows that it's pretty dire. You know, there was a suicide cluster a few years ago in parts of Melbourne. The only stat that I know of is that when it comes to the respect line, you know, the domestic violence respect line, they get data from callers based on country of birth. The first largest group of callers is from Australia, and that encompasses everyone, all ethnic identities born in Australia. The second largest group is those who are born in India. And if you drill down and look at the stats of the Indian-born women, like women's population in Australia, and then that being the second largest group of callers to the respect line, they don't add up. So there's something quite deep and profound that's going on in the gender dynamics in the Indian South Asian community in Australia. And I really wish that someone could explore that in more detail than this book can.
I could not agree more, because some of my work also involves talking with people who are working in that space, and 100% there's an issue there with domestic violence, and also there's an issue with women and new migrants and women on dependent visas not knowing their rights, not knowing where they can go to for recourse, and not having that community around them that can support their rights. And, you know, so there is all of that. And perhaps as you was talking, Aarti, I was thinking perhaps that's a whole new book. So maybe that's coming up.
Well, I will plug a book that's already out there. It's called Daughters of Durga by Manjula O'Connor, who is a Melbourne-based psychologist or psychiatrist, I'm not sure which one, let's say psychologist, who has done a lot of work with Indian women and Indian communities. And she's actually really pushed the dial on the issue. She's done some training sessions with Victoria Police. She's done submissions and managed to get dowry issues listed as a form of coercive control in Victoria. Hopefully other states will follow.
I'd love to connect with her. So you've given me an idea as well to take this conversation forward. But I will come back to you, Swagata. We got sort of waylaid, although in an important conversation. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about hyphenated identities, because we're a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and sometimes a little bit more of this than that. What has been your personal experience in navigating that? And where do you find some sort of like the comfort zone in being, you know, in someone who's kind of integrated all of those identities within who you are now?
Big question. I think that it's a kind of never-ending quest, really, isn't it? It's not, I'm 54 now. I feel probably more comfortable than I ever have felt. Even the decision to feel confident and comfortable enough to put a submission in for this book, I wouldn't have done that 10 years ago. But I think, I guess what happens, you talked about this at the start of this podcast, but what happens when you're much younger is that for me, there was a lot of hiding of everything to do with my Indian identity, and a lot of really desperately trying to assimilate and be as, white Anglo as possible. And then you kind of have that period where you're fetishized about the things that you bring as an Indian person. So you're kind of the token. I've got a friend who's Indian, so I can't be racist. And and she dances, or can you dress up, and do you have the ticklies? And so all of those sort of things, the kind of white men that really want to, I'll say politely, date you because you're a person of color. But there's kind of this process, I feel, that as you get to an older age, in your 40s and 50s, where you start being able to kind of look at and choose the things that you really love from your Indian culture and upbringing, and choose the things that you really love from being Australian and living in this amazing country, and then try and kind of pull it together in some way. And then I think that gets really magnified when you have children. So, and just trying to think about which elements of the Indian culture you want them to really love and which ones you want to absolutely avoid at all costs. And just kind of circling back to that gender conversation, I'm a really fierce feminist. And I think that this is one of the things that has been incredibly challenging for my father in particular, because the conversations that I will have now, because I want my daughters to hear things differently to the way that I did, can be incredibly tricky. So I guess you start really selecting the pieces that you're going to take on and the ones that you're going to really challenge, and you kind of mesh them, but it's just a work in progress all the time, I think, and I have times where I regret that I haven't really maintained a lot of the traditions that I grew up with. And when my parents pass away, a lot of the traditions that we had are slowly kind of getting lost. And I know that once they both pass away, that I don't have the skills or the knowledge to hold those. And that's something that I'm really kind of grieving at the moment already, but I know is going to be really difficult as I get older. So there are things that I regret as well. But I feel like you kind of take what you can on where you are in your life stage, and you kind of meld it as well as you can. And over time, you also start finding, for me, like communities and friendships around you that can see you for all of your different identities, rather than expect you to be their kind of token Indian friend or the token person of color in the workplace. And
I'd love some other responses to that idea of holding all our different identities. Preeti, Rakhee, let's hear something from you on that.
I think for me, because I'm 46, as I approach 50, I've always been a fighter when it came to, being a feminist and being very outspoken with my family and fighting for everything, because I'm the eldest daughter of the eldest son. So everyone gets kind of where I'm placed, And I remember once my RG introduced me. She was in hospital and she introduced me to the person next to her, and she said, "This is, my family calls me Shonu, which is like a diminutive of Sona. This is Shonu. She's my eldest granddaughter." And I had to say, "RG, I'm not your eldest granddaughter. Kitty, who's my aunt's daughter. She's the eldest actually of the family, but she's a woman." And so I said, "Kitty is your eldest granddaughter. I'm not your eldest granddaughter." And I knew what she meant, but I kind of felt like I had to fight her every step of the way on it. And I felt like I was fighting my grandmother every step of the way. And then part of it is my father had to explain the quite awful domestic violence my grandmother experienced at the hands of my grandfather while he was growing up. And that shaped her into who she was, you know, and to be kind to her. So, you know, it's different parts of it, you know. I'm glad he told me that, but at that stage I wasn't ready to listen to it and face that part of my identity and my family history. But as I got older, and quite soon, and I think unfortunately it wasn't until after she passed away that I thought more of her perspective rather than, you know, the male perspective, because the males in my family are so larger than life, and they're the ones who tell the story, and, you know, they're the ones who take the front of stage, and the women don't drink. You know, the men do drink. And so the stories are wilder. Well, the women are sitting back, making the food and doing all the things, but they're actually the ones holding everything together. It's not until now, and I don't have children either. So that sets me outside a lot of things in Indian culture. I'm not married. I don't have a partner, and I don't have a child. So, you know, where is my identity within this society that values all of those things when I have none of those things, you know? So at one stage, in the fact that I was assistant principal gave me that sort of status, you know, and then I resigned from it because I thought that's not making me happy. So who am I in relation to this? Am I a status of who I am as a career? And I know a lot of people within the diaspora and migrant diaspora communities will understand that. So is my identity based on what I do for a living, you know? And then most recently giving myself permission to be creative, because as it turns out, I've always been creative, but I always thought I had to be career oriented. And so much like Swagata, you know, giving myself permission to submit this story. This is the same year that I've put on a play, you know, it's a 10-minute play at a festival that won Best Production, and it explores the idea of intergenerational trauma, which I want to develop about the stories of the women in my family across generations. Because, you know, all of us have those family albums we look at, but the stories are lost. And we wish we could have asked more about the stories, because, you know, what is humanity, you know, unless we have a longer history of our oral tradition in telling each other stories than we have of a written culture. So I think identity based on the stories that we tell ourselves generationally, and the importance some of them have over the years, and then less as we understand ourselves in relation to those stories in our family. And I think explaining it to people from a Western culture that don't have a community culture, that you see yourself in relation to your community and thus their stories, and that shapes your identity, must feel very alien. I quite often use the example of when I do these kind of lessons with students, when I have a classroom full of students, I say, when you go to a party, you know, a gathering, and someone brings a baby in, is the baby introduced to everyone, and then they get taken from the parent, and, you know, they're passed around, and, you know, someone feeds the baby or whatever, and eventually the baby will make its way back to the parent, and they'll feed them or take care of them or whatever. Or does the person walk into the party and go, this is my baby, you can look at the baby, you can say hello to the baby, but you cannot touch the baby? And that for me, is that's identity in a community setting explained to children, and some get it and some don't. So for me, that it ebbs and flows like with everyone. It depends on when I'm less ready to take on a story or not. And then, you know, making my own stories now as someone at 46 who's been given a gift that my ancestors would never have imagined, to be creative, to write plays, to write stories, to do a PhD, you know. So that's the greatest gift that they, you know, things that they would never have thought possible for people working sugarcane fields, you know. So that forging of a new identity for me is also gratefulness for where my family history has also come from, you know. So it's not just an individual approach to identity for me. It's very much, increasingly very much community based. Me in relation to my community, my family, and my stories.
How wonderful. Rakhee, did you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, mine's very different, I suppose. It's funny, you know, growing up, I was always very aware I was the Indian kid. And so being Indian and, was a big part of who I was. And so when I moved to India, it was like, well, you know, I'm coming home, I'm Indian. And all I got was, you're not Indian. You're not Indian at all. Listen to you. You can't even speak Gujarati properly. You may have the name Rakhee, you can't even pronounce it properly. And I'm just like, oh my God. You know, and I found that struggle of, okay, so I'm in India and now I'm not Indian. And then when I came to when I had my daughter's from Bhubaneswar, and I'm Gujarati, so she's a different color to me, right? I don't care, like, it doesn't affect us. But what we found was in India, it affected every single person who laid eyes on the two of us together, to the point where, and I will not use Hindi, but we would get in a rickshaw, and we had a rickshaw driver once very early on mutter under his breath, where did you steal her from, in Hindi? And my father was with me at the time. My father would never hurt a fly. He nearly punched him. Like, it was quite obvious to people that, you know, you two don't belong together. So when we came back here, I was worried that we were going to face that here. And, you know, being Indian, and I was the Indian girl growing up and whatever, no one notices. No one, half our friends ask me questions about, you know, did I look like her when I was younger? And I'm like, we're not even the same color. How can you tell she's adopted? Like, it's quite funny to me, the identity piece of what I grew up with, identifying as Indian, being in India and not being Indian at all, and then bringing back a child who everyone in India thought was not related to me, and having no one here notice. It's like, I've seen Australia move, and I know we're not where we need to be, but we've certainly progressed from where we were in the 1970s and 80s when I was growing up, and things have changed and people do look at things differently. And for me, that identity piece continues to evolve, because I don't know what I am anymore, but it's whatever it is that we've shaped is who we are. And I suppose, you know, I'm in between Preeti and Swagata's age, so I think I'm very much like them. As I get older, I don't really care anymore. It's just, this is who I am. As long as my daughter feels comfortable with who she is, I'm okay with that.
Yes, yes, of course. It's interesting, though, how different each of these experiences are, just right here in this space, right? I am a little bit interested in, you know, it's a different experience from mine, because I left India when I was 27, 28, and I went to the US, and I was the only brown girl in a white office or 30 white people. But you know, by that time, I feel like I didn't need to hide or not be Indian, perhaps because I was older. But talking, you know, listening to these things about like when you're young, when you're a child, and then wanting to just blend in and just be like everybody else, and let my food not look different, and let me not have to dress different, and let my mother not come with like oil in her hair or whatever. Like all of those things, I didn't navigate that. So it's interesting that this is the lived reality for many who've grown up between these two cultures and identities. I do want to talk a little bit in that vein about code switching, and at what point did that sort of become natural. And Aarti, you've spoken about code switching in your preface to the book, and how, you know, that's part of the lived experience for many. Did you want to talk about that at all? Just in terms of code switching, navigating brownness in skin and in our minds, and, you know, also in terms of the optics of other people viewing you first as a brown person, and then all the other things about accent and language coming in to play their own role.
So I suppose we should probably start with a definition of what code switching is, and my very clumsy definition. And please, if someone else has a better definition than please jump in. But it's basically when you are one way in one space, say home, and another way you accede to the culture of the outside space, whether that's school or work. And you constantly feel like you're switching between these two different ways of being, or modes, or codes. And it can be quite difficult and tiresome after a while to, or, you know, feel like you're kind of shedding one skin and taking on another, growing another, or like putting on a cloak, or just constantly pretending. And it could be, I've got a Muslim colleague here in Canberra who is who used to work in the press gallery, and she'll describe that really well. She'll be like, I wear a hijab at home, I pray 5 times a day, I speak with my Western Sydney bogan accent, and then I go to work and I've got to, you know, pretend, like show my hair, pretend to be a whole other way. You know, if I want to pray, I go and pray in the toilets and pretend I'm going to the toilet, but I'm really praying. And for me, I think I don't have the burden of that much code switching to do, because even growing up, I felt like I was in a very balanced space. I was living amongst a very multicultural community, had a lot of Indian kids in my school. In fact, a lot of them are in my direct friendship circle. I never really felt out of place, or that I didn't belong, or that my culture wasn't or worthy of being celebrated. But I remember one incident when my mother had one of her colleagues, a very friendly Australian lady, and she was over and just they were having coffee together. My mum was making barfi, and the lady, she was cutting them into the little diamond shapes. And the lady said, "Oh, what's that?" And my mum said, "Oh, it's barfi. It's an Indian sweet." And this woman just looked really baffled. So I kind of jumped in trying to be helpful. I said, "It's like coconut ice." She goes, "Oh yeah, that's it. That's what it is." And then she tasted it, expecting something to taste coconutty and vanilla-y, and it was full of cardamom, and she really spat it out. It was so funny. To me, that's a really kind of a clear visual example of what it is to code switch, to kind of take one thing that we know as being one thing and give it a different name that's a bit more accessible to a wider population. And that's why in my introduction I talked about, and something that I felt for a long time, that to be acceptable in Australian society means to take all the different elements of this great, vast, ancient culture in all of its, messy, sometimes quite ugly glory, and flat pack it, because you're trying to kind of extract just the essence of what it is to be Indian in a way that is palatable and therefore accessible to the wider population. And I think you gain one thing by doing that, which is understanding and acceptance in Australia, but you lose a lot at the same time. And I think that's kind of this calculation that every migrant has to come to. Like, what do you bring with you, but what do you leave behind? And I think that's more so for Indians, and others might disagree with me, but because it is so rich and diverse and ancient, and there's so much pride in that as well.
Each thing that each one of you are saying, it's like it's giving rise to so many new questions, because one of the things about sort of flat packing your identity and all of that, I feel like it leads to some sort of a dissonance then between your inner and outer worlds, between the optics of who you are, between what you sort of give up to have that social life. But again, I was thinking also about insularity, and there are some Indian communities in diasporic, situations, who, in order to preserve that culture that you speak of and the traditions, will turn inward. And perhaps I find a shadow side to that as well, because the fact that when you're turning inward, then it's almost like all the negative things also get multiplied, and all of those then are things that are not talked about, and they're brushed under the carpet. And so there is that thing of, yes, when you flat pack and you kind of opening yourself out in certain ways, you are losing something of who you are and where you come from. And then the opposite of that, when you're in little silos and you don't want to integrate, or you feel like I'm Indian and I must have only Indian friends, for instance, or I'm Chinese and I must have only. I lived in Singapore and I lived in the US and I've lived here now. And in some places I have seen that little, that bent towards, let me just stick to my own people, because if I don't, I will lose something and my children will lose something. And related to that point is that, there's a little bit of force feeding sometimes with the next generation about culture. Let them learn how to play the tabla, let them learn classical, Indian music. And I'm Bengali, so there's that whole other pressure of culture that must be preserved, and Rabindra Sangeet that must be taught, and all of those things. So where do you find sort of, then the question then becomes that, do you let things just be the way they are as they naturally, organically progress in terms of culture? Because no culture stays the same, right, over millennia. As you're saying, we are such an ancient culture. Then do we just let things be, and as the next generation comes, they have their own culture? And or is there merit then in holding on? And I'd love to get some responses to these questions.
These are hard philosophical existential questions. I might have a crisis after this podcast is over.
I'm sorry we're going like this.
No, I love it, but I think for me, when we talk about identity and what we're preserving about culture within an Australian context, we need to think very specifically about what we mean by that, because I think Australia has a very specific history that excludes culture in a very specific way. So, if we look at, 1770 colonization based on terra nullius, so the denial of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people being here, that sets up this dynamic of a binary of identity historically in Australia, which is white European identity, the colonized identity, in a binary with the obliteration of First Nations and cultures who have survived. So it doesn't really lend itself historically to talk about, well, we had Afghani Cameliers who were Muslims here since the dawn, since this almost the birth of this nation. We've had Chinese people here since the born, since before Australia was even colonized. We've had massacres trading with First Nations people. So Australia is already part of a greater global history, which we don't acknowledge here culturally, even though those cultures have existed. So I think in order for us to thrive as new settlers, as new migrants, we have to acknowledge what has come before us and also who's been excluded in that middle ground between those binary identities before we can embrace ours. And I think for me, the voice debate highlighted that, because it's always a conversation between that dominant historical narrative identity culturally in opposition to a First Nations identity, which quite rightly needs to be acknowledged. But unless you bring the rest of us culturally, the multicultural people, that's what we are. We're not the institutional identity. We're not a First Nations identity. All of us fall into this multicultural identity. So what does that mean? So I think for me, I don't have an answer so much as we need to understand the specificities of the historical pressures and the history of this country is something that has allowed certain stories to be told and certain cultures to be celebrated, whilst denying simultaneously the identity of others, along with First Nations identity. Why don't we know that we have had Muslims in this country trading and living here for such a long time? That is an Australian identity culturally, So I don't know if it answers it so much, but contextualizes that we always need to be pushing back within Australia as to what a dominant identity is. And in terms of diaspora politics and Indian identity, there is no one universal Indian identity, even in India, having, and I have been a few times, but it's really interesting to observe Indian politics and how it's playing out as if there is one. And so I think that can be applied to that context as well. How do you celebrate what it is to be an evolving culture if you don't acknowledge who's being removed from the discourse to start off with, because then it's not an authentic conversation.
Gosh, Preeti, this is going to be a 3-hour conversation. Probably everybody sit back, get your drinks. There's so much to talk about that. I do. Thank you for that. If anyone else wants to comment to that, otherwise I'll move on to something related in a bit. Yeah, Rakhee, did you want to say?
It is very different to Preeti's. I suppose I'm looking at it from a different perspective. Culture to me is not stagnant, right? It is a constantly evolving thing. And so the culture that, my parents had in East Africa, they very much tried to preserve their Indian culture, and, they had their Indian cricket club, and they stuck very much to their own people till they were thrown out unceremoniously. But if I look at what they did change there, they changed things like, the chevra that my mother makes is completely different to what my auntie who grew up and was raised in India is. And that's because that's East Indian versus Indian. And, if I look at food across as a really microcosm of culture, I remember when I lived in Bombay, one of the chefs opened up a restaurant called NRI, and he bought all the different cuisines that have been created from around the world by Indian populations, and you could go and eat it. Oh my God.
That sounds amazing.
It was the best restaurant.
Amazing.
I don't know if it's still there, but it had, the Fijian Indian, and it had the South African Indian, and it had the Kenyan Indian, and it had everything. And it was all different, but it was all still, there was still something that was the same that sat across all of it. And it was the culture, but they had all morphed themselves. And that to me is, you know, culture changes, and it's changed. I'm watching my 78-year-old mother change every day in the way she approaches me and how I'm raising, you know, my child, and I'm not married, and, you know, all these broken norms in her culture, but she's adapting to it and changing herself as she goes, because that's culture. And so to say, you know, you flat pack it and it's there and you lay it out, well, actually, do you, or do you just create something else because you lost a bolt somewhere along the way, so you put it together in a different way?
One of the things I really wanted to comment on about culture, I totally agree with what Rakhee's saying, is it's a constantly changing thing. So it's hard to kind of, put it into a box. But one of the really big things that I've noticed whilst everyone's adapting, one of the really big differences between what I notice in the Indian culture and particularly because I work in psychiatry and mental health, and is this concept around boundaries. And it was one of the things that I had to really get my head around. So we all live as a community-minded, thinking about how we are actually in connection and relation to other people. And I can still remember in my first job in child and adolescent psychiatry, everyone talking about this child needs to individuate from their parents, and the parents don't have enough boundaries around what they're doing with their child. And I was really stunned, because everything that this family was doing was what my parents did with me. You know, it was that really strong, close connection and that overprotective. And I feel like that is one really strong element of the cultural difference. And in talking about code switching, that's one of the things that I had to learn to do, was kind of really hold in my natural style of wanting to kind of be very generous and giving and embracing everybody, and learning to keep boundaries. And it was a very strange experience for me, but, you know, I still notice that and do that in different groups of people, whether they're Indian or not. I'm curious about whether that thing's really stuck with me, and I'm curious about whether that kind of sense of boundaries and that individualism has impacted other people.
Individual versus the collective. I think at least in traditional Indian, setups, no matter where you're from, more and more coming up against that, aren't you? Younger people more and more are coming up, and I'm sure in every generation it's been that way, but I think it's far more rapid and pronounced now, because the world is in your little screens in India. So, you know, whether you're sitting in a small village, whether you're in a town, you are looking at the world, you're looking at women and men and what is happening across the world right in your own space. So Aarti, did you have something to say to that? I know you were trying to just respond at that point.
Nothing that was nothing that was of any value. So
All right.
need to leave
I
it.
wanted to, and thank you for that very considered response, Swagata. I wanted to talk to what Preeti had said a little bit briefly, maybe tangentially, about, experiences of racism. You spoke of that, Rakhee, about colorism, right? Which is very much a part of our legacy, I think, and maybe not just India, but across South Asia. I mean, I have friends from the Philippines who talk about how skin color and tone and who's light and who's dark, all of that makes a difference to their culture as much as it seems to make in ours. These are some of the things when we come here and we talk, and Indians are part of multicultural forums and, their representation and all of that. Somehow I imagine that these internal conflicts and internal dynamics of color and caste and race, these are not adequately perhaps even understood. Therefore, when there is representation of Indians in multicultural forums, there tends to be one type of voice, one type of person who represents, And, I recently was in conversation with someone from Nagaland who was here on a visiting. And there's literally, when you have a big Holi or Diwali festival, right? That is seen as Indian. That is Indian. Hindu festivals are Indian, you know. There's so much that is outside of that that doesn't have space in popular narratives. And I know, Aarti, you've addressed a couple of stories on caste and that in this anthology, which is great. But I do feel like perhaps those conversations need to be further, and we need to widen what it means to be Indian, to be truly inclusive, but being inclusive without having any power or having any empowered representation. It doesn't really go far, I think, beyond, tokenism and beyond a stage performance of folk dance from all over. But how do all, you're all women with great stories and great sort of perspectives on where we come from and where we are going. How do you feel like, as Indians, sort of representing a certain, perhaps more progressive mindset and ideology, how can we then be enablers of that change? Or do you see any other ideas that you'd like to share about truly being a little bit more inclusive?
There are a few things I can say to that. In terms of building communities alongside those people that you feel connected with, there's actually a few startups, a few startup kind of networking groups. One of them is run by another one of the contributors, Daisy Mann. She's based in Melbourne, and her group is called ASAC, Australian South Asian Centre. Then there's another one that's a bit more kind of a bit less social, more kind of work-based, called Brown Boss Babes. I think that's what it's called, in Sydney. And I believe that there are other groups as well. And I've chatted to both of them about the evolution of these groups. And Daisy certainly says, but she's got quite, a very strong membership. And she organizes social events and, various things for the people in her group. And her day job is now actually looking after this membership-based group. And she says it's full of, kind of younger women, but, across all ages, who are professional, and they genuinely want to connect with other Indians, but ones who are like them. And when I say ones who are like them, I see it as when she kind of decoded that for me, I was like, this seems to be a little bit of a rejection of the social groups of my parents' era, which are very much based along religion or language or region. You had Marathi Mandal, or, the Kannada group, and they would get together and they would just eat the food from their region. They would talk their language, and it was like they'd never left. And that's what they wanted, and that was fine. But the second generation, they don't want that. You genuinely want to connect with other people, like the fantastic people in the panel, but ones who hold the same progressive values as you. That's really important. The ones with the same outlook in life, and the ones who want to do the same things socially. So that's pretty much what these groups are based around. And I can only see that growing. I think there'll be more and more of these groups coming up. And to also speak to the previous comment about caste, I really wanted a piece about caste, something that spoke about the lived experience of caste discrimination in Australia. And I went out looking for it. And you have to understand the pool of available writers, who consider themselves Indian Australian is already pretty small. And it's smaller when you ask people to submit entire essays for consideration. A lot of people aren't going to do that, so it knocks a lot of people out of contention. But I went out looking specifically for someone who could write about that. I couldn't find them, and I actually chalk that up to migration patterns. I think people who've grown up here, meaning that their parents had to have been here, a generation ago. Maybe back then, the gates were open to only a certain kind of Indian. And those gates have widened now, which means that people from different castes are coming in, but maybe they're just not at the stage where they're ready to write about their experiences yet, or they're just going through the experiences now, or those experiences are yet to come. In any case, I couldn't find someone with lived experience, but Sunil Badami did address it in quite a lot of detail and very lyrically in his piece, which I was really pleased with. And, the book has gotten a bit of criticism for being for having contributors that are kind of on the same level, you know, professional of a certain demographic. But again, you know, I look at the book and I see the diversity. So I suppose it's just what lens you're looking at it through.
The irony of the criticism leveled that it's because there's a certain group of people has to do with Australia and who we wants to migrate to this country and who it lets in. It's the migration laws are so strict, and your diaspora community and your listeners will know this if they've tried to be here as an international student or if they've tried to migrate here. People who are born here would not be allowed to come back, you know, would not be allowed to apply to come in because it's so stringent. So, and it's a points-based system, and it's the same for Indians who got left behind in Fiji. Like in my family, there's a massive delineation between
It's always
those who
changed
got
as
it.
well.
Yeah, so between who is value. So I think, yeah, it'll take time for those stories to come through as well, because certainly in the 90s when we came through, it had to do with the fact that my parents had a tertiary education, had worked as white collar professionals that allowed us to leave Fiji, because when we go back, we meet people who know they can never leave. So, but the caste stories really had an the caste stories really had an impact on me. I actually had to stop reading when I read them, because I mean, it might come as a surprise, I'm not royalty. Maharaj is not the name that, you know, it's quite common amongst the Gurmatis to just rename themselves after Rajas or Maharaj, because why not? When you've crossed that black water and you've lost your caste, why wouldn't you just name yourself after royalty? But yeah, the caste stories really had an impact on me, and I just wanted to highlight that the Australian Human Rights Commission has published a national anti-racism scoping report, and based on that, there'll be a national anti-racism framework. Hopefully, if it goes ahead, they've got funding for it. But there's a specific section towards the end of that report that addresses caste, and I was astounded when I read that, because I'm doing that work for looking at race and how it's done in classrooms for my PhD, but I was astounded to see how the level of detail that was in there, which speaks to the fact that the commission must have had submissions about that it is a problem amongst the diaspora community here. And their recommendation is that in the consideration of legislation, or looking at legislation, that serious consideration needs to be given to caste, specifically in the way that it is used within Indian communities, so that there's legislation that shapes and sits behind it in Australia.
Yes, absolutely. And we do work in that space as well. And we do submissions very, very often on this issue. So I'm glad that, you know, it's finding space and we're able to educate people beyond, you know, what the majoritarian narrative is. Did anyone
I was just going to say, though, that diversity question, and especially, so you call it caste or call it socioeconomic background, that question I think is universal. You know, I sit on so many panels where people are saying we want diverse voices, and it's always the same people, just like what we've got here today. And it's the reality that we just don't seem to have the mechanisms yet to properly bring forth other voices. And so we keep having, you know,
Yes.
all of the same ones.
Yes, for sure, that's an opportunity area, 100%. And I think, you know, it's having that awareness of it and keeping the radar out to be inclusive when you have an opportunity, or when you're sitting at a platform or a forum or in line for a grant or whatever it is that you're doing, to have that sense and recognition that you are not representative of all Indians or even across, right? So that's a big learning. All right, we've gone really far and deep and wide, and I've absolutely enjoyed it. I did want to quickly, just to give a sense to listeners and readers of I'll just read some of the titles from the book that are quite interesting. There's one called A Chutney Alphabet of Anglo-Indian Spells. That's by Michelle Cahill. I think that just the title sounds very intriguing. There's one called Mem Sahab Marple and the Curious Case of Me. That's by Priya Sarachandran. Of course, there's an incomplete guide to every type of brown guy in the West. This is by Kishore Napier Raman. And, you know, I'm just giving this for a flavor to readers so they go out and grab the book. And I will ask you in just a minute where the book is available and where everybody can go and get their copies. There is also another one called Andaz Se by Feel. by Meenal Khare. There is Annette. There is My Name Is Not by Sneha Lees. Bushy Eyebrows by Daisy Mann. I think that one was an interesting one. A Brahman's Crossroads by Tejas Bhatt. There is Brown and Out by Nicholas Brown. The Compositions of Curry by Shaheen D'Souza Hugh. There is Gurdwara Day by Surjit Kaur Khalsa. Car Crash Flowers, very intriguing. I haven't read that one. Car Crash Flowers by Joseph Jude. So I just wanted to mention a few of the names. This is the book, Growing Up Indian in Australia. So this book, the publisher is Black Ink. Did you want to tell me a little bit about who they are and what kind of work they do?
So yes, Black Ink is an Australian publisher. It's based in Melbourne. I suppose you could describe it as a boutique publisher of kind of high-end non-fiction. So maybe academics who want to write something a bit more commercial, they usually will go to Black Ink. It's a very reputable, and this is actually part of a series, the Growing Up series. It started with Growing Up Asian in 2004, I think it was 2006, so 17 or 18 years ago. Now that book is considered by absolutely all metrics to be a unicorn runaway success of the Australian publishing scene. It is very old, nearly 20 years old, and people still come in and ask for it. And in the course of publicising this book, so many people have come up to me and told me what Growing Up Asian meant to them. It's on a lot of school reading lists. I believe Preeti's actually taught it to her students. And then after that, they came in an incorrect order: Growing Up African, Growing Up Country, Growing Up Queer, Growing Up Disabled. I'm sure there were others that I can't remember.
Growing Up Aboriginal and Growing Up Torres Strait Islander as well.
Yes, Growing Up Torres Strait Islander is actually the most recent one. It came out about 2 months ago. So I actually had the idea for this years ago when I came up with a wish list of dream projects, and I thought, oh, that'll never happen, so I crossed it out. And then Black Ink actually came to me. I'd written for them for some of their other publications a couple of years ago, and it developed some good relationships. So they came to me and asked me to edit it. So of course I said, oh my God, yes, in a second. And I'm really proud of being part of this series. It is truly it is unique in the Australian publishing scene in the way that they have given so much space and so much energy towards marginalised communities in Australia. I can't think of another publisher or another series of books that has done the work that this has done to really elevate not just one voice in each community, but multiple voices, the multiple perspectives of different disabled people or Aboriginal people. So I'm truly grateful to be a part of this project, yes.
Wonderful. And very quickly, before we wrap this up, where is it available? Is it all the online spaces? Is it in bookstores?
Oh, both. So it's in bookstores, it's on Amazon, it is no longer on Booktopia. It is available at the Black Ink website as well. So you can just Growing Up Indian in Australia.
Thank you so much. I am so glad that we could make this happen. And I hope more and more people go and get their own copies. And I hope that the conversations we've had today continue in various forums, in various spaces. So thank you very much.
I will go and attend to my existential crisis now. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye, ladies.